Good morning and welcome back to another episode of the Red Chip Poker Podcast. I'm your host, James Woodsuit Sweeney, and today we're going to be talking about rivers, and more specifically, defense on the river. So whether you're facing a triple barrel, a double barrel on the turn and river, whether you're facing a check and then bet on the river, making sure that you understand how to look at this decision. This is very important, even if you play in passive games, there's not a tremendous amount of river barreling or anything like that, or if you do already play in more aggressive games, this is very good to know. It prepares you for playing in a wide plethora of games against a wide plethora of opponents, and as such you definitely want to make sure you have this concept massively understood. So all of these questions were posted by Shane in the Discord, and you can always join today, ask your own questions, might even get featured on the podcast as well. redchippoker.com/discord to go right there, join for free today, start posting hands, asking questions, and getting answers and discussion from players that take the game just as seriously as you do. So without further ado, let's jump right into the first question from Shane. Alright, so the first question is essentially paraphrased down to how often should we be folding facing a river c-bet? And river c-bet by definition just means that there were previous bets before it, so essentially facing a triple barrel. Now the GTO answer to this comes out to somewhere between 40 and 50%, and that's just looking at tons of different situations and spots, and it averages out to in that ballpark. So if we were to take kind of a base model situation of this, and let's just say it's a king 7 deuce rainbow flop, and you're out of position, you check call facing that flop c-bet, you check call the turn, which is a jack putting up a backdoor flush draw, and then a brick 5 on the river, again you check face another bet, and let's just assume that bet's around 70% pot. You should be folding here roughly 46% of the time. And you notice if you look at a bunch of different situations, assuming not like the absolute worst river card in the world or the worst possible run out in the world, look at kind of an average smoothed out situation and sample, you're typically looking at something between 40 and 50%, at least according to the GTO solver. Now, of course, the GTO solver is assuming you're playing against a GTO opponent, and humans do not play perfectly GTO poker. So as such, we should be also considering the exploitative side of things. And from an exploitative point of view, you should expect to see this number typically go a little bit higher. So something in like the 50 to 60-ish ballpark, usually something in the low to mid 50s. And the reason for this is that most players just simply don't bluff quite often enough on the river, and as such you should expect, again, a little bit more value in that range, and it wouldn't make any sense for you to start continuing even more liberally. So again, that fold frequency is going to increase a little bit more often than the GTO solver would suggest. If you were to go back and check your HUD right now or your database, and if you have a decent sample size, you're probably going to look at your own numbers and be like, oh, okay, well, my fold versus river c-bet is probably something in the 50-ish ballpark. If it's below 40, you are way too loose and you're just calling a tremendous amount of time. Or if it's above 60, chances are you're being too tight, too nitty. And it's not to say that there aren't situations where you should do that, right? Against a complete bluffing fish, that could make sense to, again, get much stickier. If they are very, very nitty, it might make sense to hero fold a little bit tighter as well. But for your average opponent, being somewhere in kind of the mid-ish, lowish 50s, the fold versus river c-bet makes a tremendous amount of sense and should be probably your overall average aim point. And then the same conversation really applies to live cash game players as well. Again, that fold versus river c-bet probably being around 50%. Now, keep in mind, there typically tend to be two different kind of players out there. There are players that will bluff the river a tremendous amount of time given the opportunity, and there are players who will most likely not triple barrel very many bluffs, if any. So you kind of have to deduce this, and the deduction is going to really discern whether or not you are getting really, really sticky with kind of the more marginal hands, or if you're letting the marginal hands go, and maybe even some of the weaker strong hands as well. So again, if someone is very, very nitty, if you're playing against OMC and they decide to triple barrel you, probably doesn't make a lot of sense for you to stick around with top pair Met Kicker. Whereas if someone is playing really, really loose, really, really splashy, been betting pretty much every single street, especially bet when checked to, it could be a great situation for you to get sticky, even with maybe second pair, maybe even third pair. Really depends on the exact situation, but again, the number will average out your overall fold versus c-bet around 50-ish%, but against a specific opponent, you should definitely look, hey, how often is this person likely to be bluffing in this this situation, and then make your own decision to either fold or get sticky accordingly. So hopefully this helps. Again, these are kind of like average overall numbers, and it's helpful to kind of have an average aim point as well as understanding what goes into it. And as you're getting more information on your opponents, paying more and more attention, understanding how to discern those things properly, that's when you can really bend into that exploitative side of things and really start making some very clean decisions facing river c-bets. Alright, the next question, again paraphrased from Shane, is essentially, is the river fold percentage a useful stat when thinking about river play? And the issue here is that the river fold percentage is a very, very vague stat. So essentially it's just looking at any single time you're folding facing a river action. And that could be facing a triple barrel, that could be facing a river bet after the flop and turn both go check check, that could be a situation where you both check the flop and then they bet turn and follow up again on the river. So it's not a particularly defined stat, and as such, any stat that is very, very generalized can oftentimes be not the most useful thing when trying to suss out exactly what's going on in your opponent's strategy, or using as an aim point even for yourself, just because contextually you have to think about what goes into those situations rather than just looking at a vague stat, particularly one that could apply in a bunch of different ways of getting to that particular point in a hand. And honestly, even if you made this stat more specific, let's just say we used fold versus river c-bet frequency, right? There's still a lot of things that we need to know when we're doing very detailed analysis. Are we in position or out of position? How large is the overall size on that river bet? Is it a heads up or a multi-way situation when they're betting? Was it multi-way earlier in the hand and now it's heads up? So there's a bunch of different things we have to factor in. Is it a single raise pot or a 3-bet pot? These are also important things. So again, if we're going to do very detailed analysis, make sure that you're specific here. And oftentimes you can do this just by either creating a custom stat, which I know things like Poker Tracker 4 can do. A little complicated at first, but definitely something worth knowing if you're going to do very detailed analysis with big sample sizes. Or you can look for various stats within your database in order to kind of really get granular in some of these things. And you have to remember, because we're talking about rivers, oftentimes the sample sizes aren't going to be massive, just simply because how often do we get to rivers in the first place? So if you have, I don't know, a few thousand hands on an opponent, that seems like a lot, but how many of those actually went to the river? And all of a sudden you might realize, hey, I'm drawing a bunch of conclusions based upon 12 sample sizes. That's not going to be particularly useful. So make sure to keep sample size in mind, especially as you're getting more and more granular. But again, one option is to create a custom stat and make it as specific as possible, as specific as you can, which can mean factoring things like heads up versus multi-way, factoring in things like 3-bet pot versus single raise pot, factoring in versus out of position, factoring in the overall size. Those are important considerations. And if you can't do that, then you could choose a specific stat, but then use your filters overall in order to just look for, say, single raise versus 3-bet pots. So there are ways to do that even if you're not really good at creating custom stats in, say, Poker Tracker 4. That's a viable option, is combining a more specific stat, but not the most specific one in the world, combining that with a filter, so that way you can get as granular as you need to be. And then another stat that tends to get brought up in this conversation is RCE, or river call efficiency, and this essentially looks at how much you make on every dollar you invest on the river. And average aim point for this is typically between like 1.4 and 1.6. So this is a cool overall number, but again, you want to get more granular if you want to get more information out of it and really understand it more deeply, because your overall RCE, again, looks at all of those river situations. Versus if you want to get really granular with it, it might be useful to say, what's my RCE when facing a triple barrel while out of position in a single raised heads up pot? That's much more specific and going to be a much more useful way of looking at that number, rather than just, hey, what's my overall RCE? That's not going to be the most specific, most helpful thing in the entire world. So again, make sure when you have decent sample sizes, and great sample sizes especially, that you get more granular rather than just looking at these overall vague numbers, which aren't the most useful thing at the end of the day, especially if you're not thinking about how they fit into the entire thing contextually. And just for the record, if you're interested in doing even more exploration when it comes to rivers, both when facing bets and also making bets yourself, definitely make sure to check out my post-flop poker workbook. It's extremely technical and will walk you through situations like this so you can explore ranges in a more specific way, understand facing bets and pot odds and how that actually works, how you're actually doing against various betting ranges on rivers, and also look at tons of different situations: heads up pots, single raise pots, multi-way pots, 3-bet pots, all the things you need to be exploring between sessions. If you're interested, go to redchippoker.com/workbook, take you right over there, learn more, pick up your copy today, and do a few pages between sessions, and you'll start seeing this game a lot more clearly and a lot more technically. Again, redchippoker.com/workbook to learn more. All right, and then the third question, again paraphrased, is essentially, does the fold versus river c-bet frequency depend on our earlier street play? So simply put, yes. And if we think about playing flops and turns before we face that river c-bet, if we deviate, right, if we're playing too tight or we're playing too loose on those streets, that's going to impact how often we're likely folding on the river, assuming that we're playing well. So if we are playing very tight on the flop and turn, right, we're folding a lot against those earlier bets, then it would make sense that our range is going to be stronger going into the river, and as such, less of it is going to fold. So there's going to be more continuance if we're playing tighter on those earlier streets. We're going to have more continuance when we're facing that river c-bet. Conversely, if we're playing wider on those earlier streets and we're going to play the river well, we're going to have more hands that are invariably going to be able to fold against that bet, and as such, we're going to notice a higher folding frequency, again, playing the looser range of hands on the flop and turn. So keep that in mind. What you do on those earlier streets is going to impact what your overall river folding frequency is going to look like facing that river c-bet. But that should just make a lot of sense overall. And if you're not thinking about that, you can also apply that to your opponents as well. Thinking about if they're playing tighter on those earlier streets, then probably going to be a little bit more difficult to get them to fold when you decide to barrel off on the river. So be careful when you're selecting your own river betting range when they are playing that way on the earlier streets. And if you're looking to put some numbers behind that, we should be folding roughly 40 to 50% of the time facing those flop and turn c-bets. And obviously it should be a little bit more often, a little bit higher folding frequency when we are the out of position caller, and a little bit lower of a folding frequency when we are the in position cold caller. So keep that in mind. And again, hopefully that helps you kind of frame this entire thing a little bit more holistically, rather than just getting super micro on the river as a whole, but looking at the entire macro of a hand and your overall frequencies. All right, and then the fourth question from Shane, again paraphrased, is essentially, what should I do if my river fold to c-bet stat doesn't look quite right? So the first thing you want to do is actually not look at the river number. You want to look at your flop and turn numbers first to make sure that those stats look reasonable, because if they're not reasonable, then it's not going to be particularly useful to look at those river numbers. So make sure that your flop and turn numbers look roughly like what I mentioned earlier, and if they're not in that ballpark yet, then there's really no reason to start on the river, because you have to fix the flop and turn issues first, and by the time you fix those, it's going to fix the river number, and as such, why focus on the river number right this moment? So again, start with the flop and turn numbers, make sure those are in the correct ballpark first. Now, assuming that your flop and turn numbers look okay, let's go forward and look at the fold versus river c-bet stat. If it's too high or too low based upon what we looked at earlier, then you want to do a specific filtering and go from there. So the first thing you can do, if your number is too high, right, if you're folding too often, then you would set the filter for faced river c-bet equals true, called river c-bet equals true, and hand type is second pair or lower. Or if your overall number is too low, then what we're going to do is set a filter for faced river c-bet equals true, called river c-bet equals false, and hand type is top pair or better. And if you have a decent sample size, this would be a good time to add some extra filtering on top of this. So you could break it out for heads up versus multi-way pots, 3-bet versus single raise pots, in position versus out of position. But if you don't have a huge sample size, this will at least pull up some numbers that you can get started with and pull up some hands that you can start exploring. And that's really what we're doing here, is looking at a bunch of hands that are likely going to be spots where we could possibly make some strategic changes. Not saying you guaranteed are, not saying you play these hands poorly by any stretch of the imagination, or even really poorly, but they are definitely spots worth reviewing that are all related to this fold versus river c-bet situation, or just facing river c-bets in general. So spend some time through here, and if you're doing this, you're going through these hands, and if you only have like 10 hands to show up in this filter, or 15 or 20 or even 30, like just go through all of them. Honestly, just like quickly go through them and say, hey, are things coming up? Am I oftentimes, even when reviewing this, not 100% sure if I like my line or don't like my line? This is a great time to start posting some hands in the Discord. Again, redchippoker.com/Discord to jump on in, post a hand or two, and honestly just say, hey, I'm not really sure what to do. Here's the information in the hand. What would you do in this situation? Go. That can be extremely useful. Get some crowdsourcing, get some opinions from players that are also playing the games like you are, that also care about improving their strategy. This can be very, very helpful, especially if you're going through these hands. You're like, I don't know, it looks okay, I guess, maybe. That's a perfect time to go ahead and post it over in the Discord. And that, I think, is going to wrap it up for this conversation. Hopefully this helps kind of frame the conversation when you're facing that bet on the river C-bets especially, and having some better ideas on what to look for from a number perspective, from an overall frequency perspective, from a general strategy perspective. Hopefully this gives you some great places to start. And if you have a good database, if you're an online player who has a good HUD and database setup, make sure to go through those hands, set those filters if you're not 100% sure, check all the stats we talked about in this episode, and let us know if you have any questions. Again, redchippoker.com/Discord to dive in and let us know how we can help you. As always, if you need anything at all, don't hesitate to let us know. Otherwise, we'll see you back in a couple weeks with a brand new episode. And in the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.